Hello there, this is Senaris. In this video, we'll be talking about the response of the US government and employers during the coronavirus pandemic. I'd like to make a couple disclaimers at the start of this video. First, this video is very US-centric, which I mention because only about half the people that watch my videos are from the US. Since just about every country is handling the pandemic better than the US, government agencies and employers in your country may be handling things very differently. I'm specifically critiquing the US response. Second, this video is a lot more negative than the stuff I usually make. I want my channel to focus mainly on optimistic and wholesome content, but I'd like to talk about real-life politics sometimes as well, and real life just isn't as pleasant as Yoshi's Island. Check out my other videos if you'd like to watch something more lighthearted. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, is the federal agency in charge of public health and disease prevention. While ostensibly a non-political organization, it has a long history of letting political and economic issues interfere with what's in the best interest of public health. The horrifically racist Tuskegee experiments, which left hundreds of black men infected with syphilis untreated for decades, and the passage of the Dickey Amendment, which prevented funds allocated to the CDC to be used to study the effects of gun violence on public health, are two prominent examples from before the pandemic. When it comes to COVID, the CDC has been criticized by people all over the political spectrum for politicizing the virus. In March of 2020, Anthony Fauci, a leading US public health official and advisor to both Presidents Trump and Biden, said in a 60 Minutes interview that there is no reason for people to be walking around with masks.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask.
Later, Fauci and the CDC changed their guidance to wearing masks being very important to preventing transmission of the virus, at sometimes advocating for multiple masks to be worn. Fauci later clarified that his earlier statement was made due to an incomplete understanding of how the virus worked at the start of the pandemic, and because he believed that there may be shortages of masks for healthcare workers if everyone started wearing them at the start of the pandemic. Some people saw this as a justified white lie to protect healthcare workers, while others saw this as a nefarious attempt to manipulate and control the American people on behalf of various institutions and people, such as the government as a whole, the pharmaceutical industry, Bill Gates, or shape-shifting reptilians. On the extreme end, some people saw this flip-flop as evidence that the government is lying about the existence of the virus entirely, which has unfortunately continued to the present day. For transparency's sake, I'll mention here that I'm inclined to believe Fauci's clarification and that while the CDC isn't free from nefarious actions, as I'll discuss shortly, I don't think they lied for the sake of control or manipulation. Another CDC guideline that has changed over time has been how long to quarantine if you are infected. Early on, it was established that people exposed to the virus should quarantine for 14 days. Note that this isn't people who tested positive should quarantine for 14 days, just being exposed to someone meant you should quarantine to play it safe and make sure you don't develop symptoms. For those that were infected, the guidelines were to isolate themselves for 10 days after a positive test of infection. A few days ago, on December 27, 2021, the CDC updated its guidance to recommend that infected people only need to isolate for 5 days, and people exposed to the virus should quarantine for 5 days unless that is not feasible, in which case that person should wear a well-fitting mask at all times when around others for 10 days after exposure. By unless that is not feasible, I think they mean unless your boss says to come to work anyways. Now, why would they change the isolation period from 10 days to 5 days when previously, simply being exposed meant that you should quarantine for 14 days to make sure you don't develop symptoms during that timeline? Do we have data to suggest that we were wrong about previous quarantine and isolation guidelines? Has the virus decided that we've had a rough 2 years and now it's going to go easy on us? Does capitalism treat ever-increasing profits as more important than human lives and corrupt every institution it touches, including the ones in charge of public health? I'll leave that up to you to decide, but I don't think it's coincidental that this is happening during an alleged labor shortage while record numbers of people are leaving their jobs and while COVID cases and deaths are just as bad as they were in March of 2020 when we knew very little about the virus and had no vaccine for it. On Monday, December 27th, the same day the CDC cut the isolation period in half, President Biden told a meeting of the state's governors that there is no federal solution to COVID and it must be solved at the state level, something Biden supporters were criticizing Trump for a year ago. After that, he got on a helicopter and went on vacation. A day later, on the 28th, the CDC reported the highest single-day total of new COVID cases, with 441,278 cases. One of President Trump's worst sins as a president was the sheer number of preventable deaths due to COVID, but President Biden seems intent on outdoing him in that regard. So much of the guidance given by the CDC and the federal government seem to align with corporate interests rather than the public health that I don't think you need to be a crazy socialist like me to see what's going on. Neither Presidents Trump or Biden have done anywhere near what's in their power to help the US overcome the virus. At any point, they could have enacted national rent freezes and given everyone free health care for the duration of the crisis, a power given to the president under Obamacare. Congress could have passed a bill introduced by Senators Bernie Sanders, Ed Markey, and Kamala Harris to give every American $2,000 a month for the duration of the pandemic. Unemployed benefits could be extended again to people whose employers are claiming them to be essential workers when many of those employers are just taking advantage of how intentionally vague that term is. Remember when GameStop claimed all of its workers were essential workers to avoid shutting down during lockdowns? We could have looked at what other countries who are handling the pandemic much better than us are doing to combat it and asked for their help. We could have had stricter federal vaccine mandates and lockdowns to contain the virus instead of leaving it in the hands of extremist red state governors that are doing everything in their power to spread the virus. Instead of doing any of these things, which would have seen people safe at home not catching or spreading the virus at work, the federal and state governments have decided to pretend the pandemic is over and it's time for everyone to head back to the office. The bottom line is that the federal government is not acting in the interest of its citizens because through the legalized bribery we call lobbying and campaign contributions, most of the people in Congress have simply been paid not to pass legislation that would help normal people. They would rather let people get evicted and become homeless than provide rent relief. They would rather people go into further debt than forgive student debt. And they would rather let people work for starvation wages instead of pass a $15 minimum wage, all because they are paid to work for corporate interests, not the interests of the people who voted for them. The only people coming out on the winning side of these decisions are corporations and their shareholders. They have decided to put their employees' lives at risk for the sake of increased profits and increased control over their labor. Twitter user CatContentOnly pointed out that several days before the CDC made their decisions, multiple airline companies sent letters to the CDC with nearly identical language requesting that the CDC make the specific changes that they eventually did. I'm sure many companies and industries besides these have been lobbying the CDC, Congress, and state governments, as well as the president himself, to get back to normal, as they say. On December 29th, Fauci clarified further that reducing the isolation time to 5 days was decided so that people could get back to jobs. If you've been on Twitter the last few days, you've surely seen the endless CDC jokes. They seem to be on a mission to shred whatever credibility they had left. It should be pointed out that while corruption and incompetence have a lot to do with the horrible US response to the pandemic, neoliberal capitalism is also to blame. When markets are treated like the solution to everything and societal failings are reframed as individual failings, crises like a global pandemic are very difficult to solve. Market worshippers will claim that human sacrifices are a necessary evil because we cannot let the line go down. The idea of following what other countries with much larger populations but a fraction of the deaths are doing is dismissed out of hand because that would be authoritarian or un-American. Isn't using a heavy hand to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people a preferable use of authority than not using it at all? Isn't it more patriotic to save your people than let almost 1 million of them die? This is the behavior one should expect from a death cult, not the greatest country in the world as Americans tell themselves. The deaths of incomparable amounts of people is just seen as inevitable, and the Biden administration has all but given up trying to do anything about it. Since I feel like I've been sufficiently doomer in this video, let's talk about what we can do about it. First, I feel like I should address the elephant in the room, or more accurately, the donkey in the room. The solution to how do we survive a health and economic crisis which is being ignored by both Republican and Democratic politicians who are bribed to ignore it is not simply to vote for more Democrats or Republicans, Both parties are complicit in the endless wars, the 50 years of stagnant wages, the declining standards of living and life expectancy, the poor education and healthcare systems, and the cultural tensions that exist between Americans. This problem will require more than spending 5 minutes a decade in a voting booth. Capitalism cannot be reformed to provide everyone with a healthy life of dignity and freedom. The best it can do is temporarily do that for the citizens of one country by taking advantage of the citizens of others through imperialism. We need to move past capitalism entirely. Every little thing we do to help in that effort is worthwhile. Join a socialist organization or party. Join a union or talk to your coworkers about joining or starting one. Run for local office as a member of a socialist party. Join a mutual aid group. Make socialist art, propaganda, and agitprop. Start a YouTube channel where you crowbar socialist theory into classic video games that have nothing to do with socialist theory. The point is to actively work for a better future. History isn't passive, it's made by groups of people with the will to change it. I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes, a part of a speech by science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin. "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, very often in our art, the art of words." Thank you for watching. Peace.